If you think survival food means canned goods in a basement or dusty jars on a pantry shelf, you've only seen part of the story. True survival cuisine is all about ingenuity, how people with limited resources stretched every ingredient, conserved every scrap, and used every technique that would keep food edible and nutritious long past harvest. African American communities, shaped by hardship, displacement, limited access to refrigeration, and a history of agricultural labor, evolved preservation methods that were not only practical, but often brilliantly resourceful. These techniques were survival skills long before survival became an Instagram hashtag. Today on The Lost Taste, we're uncovering 15 forgotten food preservation techniques African Americans used for survival, methods born from necessity, refined over generations, and often lost to modern convenience. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up if you love food history, and let's dive deep into the traditions that kept families fed in the toughest times. 1. Salt curing. The primary method for preserving meat, especially pork, was salt curing. Without refrigeration, salt was the key to survival. After slaughter, cuts of pork were rubbed vigorously with coarse salt, sometimes layered with salt in barrels or wooden boxes. This might seem simple, but it was a calculated practice. The salt drew moisture out of the meat, creating an environment where spoilage bacteria couldn't grow. The process also concentrated flavor, producing a salty, firm meat that could last for months in a smokehouse or cool cellar. Scraps and trimmings were tucked into cracks, ensuring nothing went to waste. This technique was more than preservation. It was insurance against lean months, feeding families through winter and crop failures when fresh meat wasn't available. With the advent of refrigeration and commercial curing processes, home salt curing lost its necessity. But back then, it was the baseline for survival. Point 2. Smoking. Smokehouse. Once meat was salt cured, the next step was the smokehouse. Imagine a wooden shed at the edge of a yard, fires smoldering in pits below racks of hams, sides of bacon, shoulders, and even whole hogs. Slow-burning fires using hickory, oak, applewood, or pecan didn't just add flavor. They acted as preservative agents. The smoke infused the meat with phenols and other compounds that helped repel insects and inhibit bacterial growth. Smoking wasn't a quick process. It took days, sometimes weeks of low, steady heat and smoke to draw out moisture and deepen the shelf life. For rural African American families, smokehouses were as essential as kitchens, a place where butchered meat became sustenance that could outlast a season. As refrigeration became widespread, old smokehouses fell into disuse, along with the practice of slow smoking meat at home. 3. Potting confit, storing in lard. After pigs were butchered and lard was rendered, nothing was wasted. Lard, the pure fat extracted from pork, was heated and used to preserve cooked meats in a method similar to confit. Pieces of cooked meat or sausage were placed in ceramic crocks and completely covered with hot liquid lard. As the fat cooled and hardened, it formed an airtight seal that prevented air and bacteria from spoiling the food inside. This wasn't just practical, it was sensory comfort. When a jar was cracked open in winter, the smell of rich fat and slow-cooked meat carried memories of family gatherings, harvest time, and shared struggle. Potting ensured that cooked meat could last without refrigeration throughout the winter months. Today, with refrigeration and commercial vacuum sealing, this technique has mostly disappeared from home kitchens, surviving only in culinary history. 4. Sausage making. African American cooks mastered the art of turning every part of an animal into food, especially pork, which was widely accessible in the rural South. When meat scraps, organ meats and trimmings were left after butchering, they were ground up and mixed with seasonings like sage, black pepper, and salt, spices that also helped deter insects and slow spoilage. The seasoned mixture was then stuffed into cleaned intestines and tied into links. The result was sausage, a compact, portable, long-lasting form of protein that could be smoked, hung, or cooked immediately. Unlike modern mass-produced sausages, These were made by hand, often in large batches, turning root to tutor, as old cooks would say, meaning use every part from the root of the tail to the tip of the snout. In a survival context, sausage making was both necessity and art, ensuring nothing edible went to waste. With industrial meat processing and pre-packaged sausages, these handcrafted traditions faded. 5. Pickled pig's feet. Bones and feet might seem like parts destined for soup stock at best, but African-American cooks elevated them into preserved delicacies. Pig's feet and other collagen-rich cuts were boiled until tender, then packed into jars with a strong solution of hot vinegar, salt and spices, often mustard seed, peppercorns, and bay leaf. The acid in the vinegar stopped bacterial growth, transforming these gelatin-rich cuts into a tangy or protein-packed staple that could last for months. Served cold or warmed, pickled pig's feet were a survival food and a flavor statement, especially when fresh meat was scarce. Modern palates have shifted away from pickled feet, and ready-to-eat delicacies replace these labor-intensive preservations. But for generations, this method put food on the table when fresh resources were limited. 6. Potato hills, mounds. Beyond meat, survival required ingenuity with vegetables and roots. Sweet potatoes and other root crops were essential because they stored well, if done right. To preserve them without a costly cellar, families built conical mounds. A shallow hole was dug, lined with pine straw, dried leaves or corn stalks, then filled with harvested potatoes and covered with more straw and dirt. This natural insulation regulated temperature, kept humidity stable and prevented freezing during harsh winters. The technique, simple yet effective, allowed stores of root vegetables to last months and provide steady calories when little else was available. With modern root cellars, refrigeration and frozen storage, this practice has almost disappeared, but it was once a cornerstone of food security. Point 7. Drying black-eyed peas. Legumes like black-eyed peas were vital sources of protein, especially when meat was scarce. Instead of harvesting pods when green, many families let them stay on the vine until the pods dried completely in the sun or breeze. Once dry, the peas hardened and could be stored in cloth sacks or wooden bins for years. When needed, they were soaked and rehydrated into soups or stews. This method maximized the food value of each harvest, turning an abundant crop into long-term survival food. In modern agriculture, canned or packaged dried beans and controlled storage replaced the need for sun-drying and on-farm storage. But for generations, this was how protein survived the seasons. 8. Chow chow, end-of-harvest relish. At the end of a long-growing season, when gardens were winding down and fresh produce was threatening to spoil, African-American cooks, especially in the South, embraced chow chow. This relish was a vibrant combination of green tomatoes, cabbage, onions, peppers, and other vegetables finely chopped then preserved in a brine of vinegar, mustard and spices. It was a true waste-nothing food, transforming leftover vegetables into a tangy, piquant condiment that could enliven otherwise bland meals in winter. The high acidity of the pickling solution prevented microbial growth, making chow chow last for months. Its roots are deeply interwoven with survival. When gardens were slipping, this relish held the garden's bounty into lean seasons. Today, the relish survives in pockets of Southern cookery, but its role as a survival staple is often forgotten. 9. Drying herbs and peppers. Long before freezers, herbs and spices had to be preserved for year-round cooking. African-American households, like many agrarian cultures, tied bundles of medicinal and culinary herbs, sage, rosemary, thyme, as well as cayenne peppers, and hung them from kitchen rafters or on porches to air dry. Once dried, these herbs and peppers lasted indefinitely, ready to season stews, soups, or pickles. Dried cayenne in particular was essential for masking the taste of meat that had lost freshness toward the end of winter, adding both flavor and heat without spoilage. Today's grocery aisles offer dried herbs in plastic jars, but the old method, drying whole herbs in sunlight and wind, is a waning tradition. 10. Cornmeal, grinding corn. Corn was more than a crop. It was a lifeline. Field corn was left to fully dry on the stalk. After harvest and shucking, the dried hard kernels were ground into cornmeal or grits. Unlike fresh, sweet corn, dried and ground corn did not spoil and would remain stable year-round, forming the basis of cornbread, mush, porridge, and more. This wasn't just a preservation technique. It was transformation, converting unstable fresh produce into stable, storable grain. In a survival context, cornmeal meant families could rely on affordable, calorie-dense food long after the harvest ended. Modern milling, imported flours and white bread have replaced the daily practice of on-farm grinding. But traditional grinding once stood at the heart of survival cooking. 11. Pickled okra. Okra, originally brought from Africa, has a short growing season and produces an abundance of pods quickly. To avoid loss and waste, excess okra was sliced or left whole, packed into jars with vinegar, salt and dill or spices, and sealed. The acidity preserved the vegetable's texture and crunch for months, turning a fleeting harvest into a stable pantry item. Pickled okra was eaten throughout winter, a crunchy, tangy reminder of summer gardens. Today, pickling remains a hobby or artisanal craft, but commercial refrigeration and year-round produce availability have diminished its role as a necessary survival skill. 12. Sun-drying fruits. In the heat of southern summers, fruits like peaches, apples, apple snits, figs or pears were sliced and spread on boards or tin roofs to sun-dry. The sun's heat evaporated water, the main cause of spoilage, leaving dried fruit rich in sugar concentration that resisted mold and rot. These dried fruits were eaten as snacks, rehydrated into stews or baked into simple pies during winter. The technique preserved sweetness without refined sugar and provided essential calories when fresh produce was gone. With the advent of commercial dried fruits and freezers, backyard sun-drying has nearly vanished, along with the memories of rooftops laden with fruit slices. 13. Molasses preservation. Refined sugar was expensive and rare, so sorghum or cane molasses became the go-to sweetener and preservative. Cooking fruit down in molasses, apples, peaches or berries, not only sweetened the mixture but created a high-sugar environment that inhibited bacteria, much like jam. The result was a dense, rustic preserve that could last through winter, spooned onto cornbread or stirred into porridge. This technique married preservation with sweetness, essential in a world before cheap sugar. As processed sugar dropped in price and commercial preserves crowded shelves, molasses-based preserves became less common, though the flavor lingers in heritage recipes. 14. Cabbage burying. Whole cabbages with roots still attached were pulled from the garden in late autumn and turned upside down into trenches, covered with dirt and left for winter. The earth insulated the heads, protecting them from freezing and preserving freshness. Like early root cellars, these underground caches offered fresh cabbage or kraut deep into winter and early spring, a valuable source of vitamins when little else was available. With modern refrigeration and convenient produce markets, the old practice of burying vegetables in earthen trenches has all but disappeared. 15. Fermenting beverages, wines, tonics. Before fruit spoiled, wild fruits like blackberries, elderberries, or even dandelions were harvested, and their juices extracted and left to ferment with sugar or honey. The fermentation process preserved calories and produced homemade wines or herbal tonics used for both enjoyment and medicinal remedy. These beverages were not just drinks, they were preserved nutrition, extending the life and usefulness of fruits that would otherwise rot. As commercial wines, sodas, and packed beverages replaced homemade brews, the tradition of fermenting beverages at home faded. 16. Root cellaring. Finally, the art of the root cellar itself, creating cool, dark, humid spaces underground to store root vegetables, apples, squash, and tubers, was vital for survival. These natural pantries kept produce from freezing in winter and from dehydrating in summer, maintaining freshness for months. Families relied on root cellars to stretch harvests through lean times. Modern refrigeration has replaced this technique in most households, leaving the practice and its associated meals forgotten by many. Engagement question. Which of these preservation techniques would you try today, and which seems impossible now? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to The Lost Taste so you never miss another forgotten method. Conclusion. These preservation techniques weren't developed for gourmet appeal or aesthetic plating. They were born of necessity, resilience, and a determination to survive. From salt curing and smokehouses to root cellars and fermenting jars, each technique tells a story of ingenuity, community, and adaptation when food was scarce. Next time you open a jar of pickles, sun-dried fruit, or a bag of cornmeal, remember the generations who perfected these methods long before modern convenience. Thanks for watching. If this journey through survival food inspired you, hit that like button, subscribe to The Lost Taste, and share your own family's preservation stories in the comments. And always remember, if you try these techniques at home, do so safely and with respect for tradition. Stay hungry for history, and see you next time on The Lost Taste.